In order to do long division, both the numerator and the denominator, or both the dividend and the divisor, must be in descending order. In other words, if you start with x cubed, then you must have x cubed, x squared, x, and a constant. If you start with x squared, it must be x squared, x, and then a constant. If you start with x to the 10th, it would have to be x to the 10th, x to the 9th, x to the 8th, x to the 7th, x to the 6th, and so forth, all the way down to your constant. If it's impossible to put both the numerator and the denominator in descending order, then you probably cannot do the long division problem. In some cases, you have to put in the placeholders in order to make it work. In other words, in some cases, you can do it. But in order to do so, you have to put in placeholders. Now remember that 0 times any expression is 0. So if I put in a 0x squared, I'm not really putting anything in. I'm just adding a 0. Adding a 0 does not change the value. I'll show you some examples. Let's divide x squared minus 3 by x minus 1. Now x squared minus 3 is not in perfect descending order. After x squared, I would expect to have x. Now this is what I mean by the 0. I can rewrite this as x squared plus 0x minus 3. It means the same thing. 0x is just 0 times x, so 0x is 0. X squared plus 0 minus 3 is x squared minus 3. So it has the same value, but it looks different. It's now in the correct form for me to do the long division. So now I can write my problem as x minus 1 into x squared plus 0x minus 3. I divide the first into the first. X squared divided by x, which would be x. Subtract the x, keep the base, subtract the exponents. Once I divide, I multiply. X times a negative 1 is a negative 1x. X times x is x squared. Once I multiply, I subtract. Change the signs and add. X squared and negative x squared is 0. 0 plus 1x is 1x. Once I subtract, I bring down. And I divide. X into 1x is 1. So you're doing 1x divided by x. That would be 1x to the 0, which is 1. Anything raised to 0 power is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. Once I divide, I multiply. A positive 1 times a negative 1 is a negative 1. A positive 1 times x is a positive 1x. Add the opposite. X's will cancel. A negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. Let's quickly look at one that's a little harder. In this case, I've got placeholders missing in both the numerator and the denominator. If I start with x fourth, I would expect x to the fourth, x to the third, x squared. I'm missing an x squared, so I've got to add it, an x and a constant. If I start with x squared, I would expect x squared and then the x and the constant. So I need to put a placeholder, the 0 something, in both the numerator and the denominator. So I can write it as x squared. Now what comes after x squared? The x. Since I don't have an x, I have to put 0x plus 1 into x to the fourth minus 2x cubed. Now what comes after 2x cubed? Be x squared. So I put in 0x squared. Then I've got the plus 3x minus 1. Once you get your placeholders, you can divide. I'm going through the division rather fast. X squared into x to the fourth is going to be x squared. So I divided the first into the first. Now I multiply. X squared times 1 is 1x squared. X squared times 0 is going to be 0x. X squared times 0x is 0x cubed. X squared times x squared is x to the 4th. Now I subtract by adding the opposite. That'll be negative, negative, negative. X to the 4th will add to 0. A negative 2x cubed. Subtract 0x cubed is a negative 2x cubed. 0x squared plus a negative 1x squared is a negative 1x squared. Once I subtract, I bring down. X squared into a negative 2x cubed is a negative 2x. Dividing, and start the sequence over dividing, first into the first. Now multiply. A negative 2x times a positive 1 is a negative 2x. A negative 2x times 0 is 0x squared. Or negative 2x times 0x is 0x squared. Negative 2x times x squared is a negative 2x cubed. Once I multiply, I subtract by adding the opposite. A negative 2x cubed and a plus 2x cubed is 0. A negative 1x squared plus 0x squared is a negative 1x squared. And a positive 3x plus 2x is a positive 5x. As you subtract, you bring down. X squared into a negative 1x squared is a negative 1. Once I divide, I multiply. Negative 1 times a positive 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times 0x is 0x. Negative 1 times x squared is negative 1x squared. Add now, or add the opposite. 0 minus plus. X squares will cancel. That leaves me with 5x and the 1's add out. So it's going to be x squared minus 2x minus 1 plus the remainder, which is 5x over, I just write it as x squared plus 1 now when I give the answer.